Free will itself is an act of rebellion and nothing less. Creative man has stepped outside the bounds of nature, and with every fresh creation, he departs further and further from her, becoming more and more her enemy. I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's video I am discussing Oswald Spengler's 1932 piece, Man and Technics, a contribution to a philosophy of life. For those of you who aren't familiar with Oswald Spengler, he is most known for writing The Decline of the West, which many people, academics, thinkers, philosophers, even psychologists, even politicians would agree that it is definitely a piece to be taken seriously. Spengler was a German historian and philosopher. In this piece and in The Decline of the West, he's notoriously pessimistic, but also realistic, you could argue as well, and his central claim, amongst many others, was the fact that man has traded his soul for forbidden knowledge, for progress, for the idea of superseding his nature. And in this book in particular, Spengler makes the case that civilization, with all of its advancements and its progress, will eventually learn to repudiate itself, and man will come to want to destroy everything that he has created. This book, which is quite underrated in comparison to his Decline of the West, which everybody reads, although I've started with this one, so I guess it's a good introductory piece because it does encapsulate many of the ideas that I've heard The Decline of the West has inside of it, as well as this one. But it is a very succinct book. It is extremely short. I read this in about an hour, I suppose, around an hour. And it has many different sections, many different points that he tries to string together. But essentially, they all come to the same thesis, which I covered before, which is that man has condemned himself. He sold his soul for forbidden knowledge, for progress. These sections are called Technics as a Tactics of Living, Herbivores and the Beasts of Prey, The Origin of Man, Hand in Tool, the second stage, Speech and Enterprise, the last act, Rise and End of the Machine Culture. And throughout all of these chapters, as you may have guessed, the first one, for example, Technics. So he defined this as the tactics of living as opposed to the tools themselves. So man uses his hands, for example, and that's the tool, but the technics is what he does with his hands and how he innovates from his hand. And obviously from the hand were weapons. First, well, I remember the 2001 A Space Odyssey, which has a really good opening. I love that opening. I thought the film was a bit too long and the shots were quite frustrating. But one of my favourite parts of that movie was the opening, where it was an exposition of prehistoric man finding not only his hands as a tool, but weapons to be held in them, to use, to dominate, to ascertain power over other people and nature itself. So yeah, the main phrase within this book is technics, which is how one uses his tools, not the tools themselves. That's very important to remember when reading the book. It's interesting because he, of course, talks about animals and how they are separate from man as a beast of prey, and how man moves, whereas an animal may move differently, and how this makes them succeed in survival and so on. He draws upon Darwinism and science. He also discussed speech and how that came across in nature, and how man dominated with speech, how it developed over time, how it, for example, developed from hand gestures and micro expressions and things like that, and then the voice served as a specific line of communication in comparison to body language. And lastly, to have an overview of the contents of the book before we go into more in depth of some of the quotes that I enjoyed and I wanted to share. The last thing that he talks about, and it's called The Rise and End of the Machine Culture. This book was written more than 80 years ago, right? And one thing that Spengler is certainly agreed upon, even those who disagree with him, clearly he saw ahead of his time, right? Because he talks about machine culture as if somebody nowadays would, right? With technology, that's essentially the juxtaposition to be made. And he says about the dangers of machine culture and how it's making us inefficient and lazy and less than men, and that's also why we will repudiate ourselves, because we no longer are in control to some extent. I'm going to read out a few quotes now, and I will go into some of them more than others, but in general I just wanted to share some of the best passages that I read in this book. Man was and is too shallow and cowardly to endure the fact of the mortality of everything living. He wraps it up in the rose-coloured optimism of progress, which no one actually believes in. He masks it with literature. He crawls behind the shelter of ideals so as not to see anything. But implements, birth and passing, is the form of all that is actual, from the stars, whose destiny is for us incalculable, right down to the fleeting concourses of this planet. The life of the individual, whether animal or plant or man, is as perishable as that of peoples of cultures. Every creation succumbs to decay, every thought, every discovery, every deed to oblivion. All around us we sense traces of lost courses of history that ended in some great doom. All around us the ruins of the past works of dead cultures lie before our eyes. Unsurprisingly, I clearly liked the most pessimistic and doomer sort of passages within this piece. I mean, there's a lot here. He talks about mortality and how people try to deny death. I mean, that's covered in, Sheldon Solomon's work, who I've interviewed on the psychology of death, as well as Ernest Becker's book, The Denial of Death, which is a favourite of mine. If you guys haven't read that yet, definitely do if you're interested in this kind of topic. The psychology and philosophy of death is fascinating, and clearly Spengler understood that the denial of death is the birth of illusion in some sense. And once we are emancipated from that fear, or at least once we become in tune with mortality, then we are emancipated, then we are free to be who we are supposed to be, because then we are free and we are aware as well of the expediency of time, and thus we appreciate it more, far more than anyone would if they believe they were immortal, because if you're immortal then you can take up any responsibility in the next 1,000 years, right? As far as you're concerned anyway. I mean, it's definitely a irrational idea, but that's clearly what the population prefers to believe, that they are immortal to some extent. This is the beginning of man's tragedy, for nature is the stronger of the two. Man remains dependent on her, for in spite of everything she embraces him like all else within herself. All the great cultures are just so many defeats. Whole races remain inwardly destroyed and broken, fallen into barrenness and spiritual decay as corpses on the field. The fight against nature is hopeless, and yet it will be fought out to the bitter end. A big theme in this book is Spengler, of course, talking about nature and how we have tried to supersede nature, how we've tried to become nature in some sense. We've contrived what it means to be nature, for something to be natural, for example. I mean, think about factory farming. Is it natural for humans to drink milk supposed to be for calves, for baby cows? No. So many people will claim that animal agriculture is normal, eating meat is normal, but actually, what is normal? What is nature, right? And so he does discuss this in great detail, and in his acumen around this topic is really fascinating. Man, the carnivore, insists consciously on increasing his superiority far beyond the limits of his bodily powers. To this will to greater power of his, he even sacrifices an important element of his own life, and the calculation for greater effectiveness comes first, and for the sake of it he is quite willing to give up a little of his personal freedom. Inwardly, indeed, he remains independent, but history does not permit one step to be taken back. Time and therefore life are irreversible. Once habituated to the collective doing and its successes, man commits himself more and more deeply to its fateful implications. The enterprise in the mind requires a firmer and firmer hold on the life of the soul. Man has become the slave of his thought. This is building upon this idea that man, as he says, consciously tries to increase his superiority beyond the limits of his bodily powers. He tries to become the god, right? Man is greedy by nature. Man wants to be the overman, the Übermensch, as Nietzsche would say. And Spengler is influenced by Nietzsche heavily in the piece. As I read out here, the will to power, that is what Spengler is drawing inspiration from, Nietzsche's idea. And he understands that man, consciously or even subconsciously, wants to be in control. He can't help himself from transcending his nature. He's a curious animal by design. He is an animal that looks at himself with his hands, right? That no other animal has. There's paws, and there's hooves and things like that. Man has the most practical tool set a priori. And so why wouldn't man automatically assume that he is better, that he is superior? It is only with this hubris, as Spengler would say, that man condemns himself to being a slave of his own thought, being disillusioned by his hubris. All things organic are dying in the grip of organization. An artificial world is permeating and poisoning the natural. Civilization has become a machine that does or tries to do everything in mechanical fashion. We think only in horsepower now. We cannot look at a waterfall without mentally turning it into electric power. We cannot survey a countryside full of pasturing cattle without thinking of its exploitation as a source of meat and supply. We cannot look at a beautiful old handiwork of a lively and primitive people without wishing to replace it by a modern technical process. Whether it has meaning or not, our technical thinking must have its actualization. The luxury of the machine is the consequence of a necessity of thought. In the final analysis, the machine is a symbol, like its secret ideal, perpetual motion, a spiritual and intellectual necessity, but not a vital one. This is Spengler going more in depth in this idea of machines and man's need to exploit the civilizations, let's say. If we go back to the Native Americans, right, that situation, that is a clear example of man wanting to take hold of other man or another population or another spirit that they seem as not as powerful, not as important, only because they only grow from the land and they haven't necessarily exploited the earth as much as those who wanted to overthrow them. And so in this sense, we clearly just can't help ourselves as a species from looking at another individual and comparing ourselves to them, and then take that to the mass scale. A civilization, when it becomes an idea, and we can all think of political regimes that, are ideas and they view others as not as strong, even not as moral, right? Not as powerful, even viewing it as a race issue, right? We can all think of those political examples, and that is precisely what Spengler is associating his ideas to. The idea that the machine is a symbol, and the machine is simply, in my interpretation, the catalyst for advancement of the human race. And those who don't subdue to this idea, those who don't take the knee to this idea, will be taken out themselves. They will be repressed. They will be fought against. And this is historically true as well as politically, of course, as they are both intertwined. Again, Spengler is really, really aware of not only the future, but also the past. And he uses both of them to understand man's nature and where we're going from where we've been. Those are all the quotes that I wanted to share with you guys in this video. This was a really interesting read. It's clear that Spengler was a very advanced intellectual thinker, and it's no wonder that his Decline of the West has been taken so well and so seriously by academics and philosophers, thinkers in general. And so I definitely want to check that out. Although probably the abridged edition, as I've seen how big the unabridged, I think it's 2-volume set is. And so yeah, I don't think I'm going to go the full set. I'm going to go for the abridged edition, I think. If you guys have read this book, then let me know what you thought of it. And if you haven't, let me know what you think of the quotes that I've shared and this book in general. And if you want to check it out yourself, please leave a like if you enjoyed this video. I'd appreciate that very much. And comment what you think, of course. That would help the YouTube algorithm, help my channel grow a bit more. All of these little things really help. So I appreciate any kind of assistance that I can get for the channel to grow a bit more. You can sign up to my Patreon, where you get early access to reviews like this one, to discussions, and other bonus content as well that isn't available anywhere else but my Patreon. So yeah, please consider that if you want to help me out just that bit more. Yeah, have a good day, and I hope you found this video interesting. See you guys.